Hi, this is Jeff from the Ozark Mountains in Missouri, USA. Today we're doing another vintage book report. You might remember that our first vintage book report featured two books, one vintage book and one new book, and they were both about Commodore. Well, today we're looking at the vintage Commodore 128 Personal Computer Handbook. And what's interesting about this book is that it's both a vintage book and a new book all in one. You might be thinking to yourself, hey Bert, how can a book both be old and new at the same time? Are there flux capacitors involved? Well, sadly, no. But it's still a very interesting book. Let's get it on the bench and have a look. So, how can a book both be vintage and new? Perhaps new ink and old paper? No, that's a clever idea, but that's not exactly it. This book was written by Margaret Morabito, and back in 1985, when the Commodore 128 was coming out, she was the technical editor for Run magazine. And she'd gotten her hands on an early production Commodore 128 for evaluation. And she had worked out an arrangement with the publisher for writing this book. So here we even see the advertisement for that book, which is supposed to be available in the fall of 1985. If you act now, you can save 20% off. But as luck would have it, just as the Commodore 128 was getting ready to be released, and she had just finished up the manuscript, the publisher pulled out, and all her hard work sat around in a box, along with the Commodore 128, for more than 30 years. So, like a lot of us have done, she decided to get her old Commodore out of mothballs and get it working again and see what was happening, if anything, in the Commodore computer scene of 2019. And boy, was she surprised. This book is kind of a fusion of that original manuscript updated with the things that today's user also needs to know about, such as modern storage options and modern interfacing, software choices, things like that. She does a good job of letting the reader know what is vintage material and what is new material. Sometimes you get a taste of what such a book would have been trying to tell a reader in 1985, and sometimes you get to contrast the things that a reader in 1985 would have been interested in what the vintage enthusiast of 2019 would be interested in. So what's in the book? Well, we've looked at one little thing already, but the foreword here was written by none other than Bill Hurd. It's kind of an interesting little read, just a single page. And then we have our advertisement that we just looked at. Chapter 1 is kind of a fact from 1985 with some 2019 perspectives thrown in. Just things you need to know about the Commodore 128 and getting started, and user groups connecting to modern displays, things like that. Chapter 2 is what the user back in 1985 would have been interested in when they were choosing a new personal computer. A lot of people didn't have any good experience with computers at that point in time, so this was kind of a set of criteria you might go about looking at to decide which computer was right for you. It's kind of interesting to see what was important for the average consumer then versus today. Chapter 3 is kind of what's in the box from back in 1985. The things that you get with your Commodore 128. What they are, what they do, and how they contrast with some of the new things available for 2019, like storage on SD cards. Chapter 4 is kind of a newbie guide. So if you're reading this in 1985 and need to know how to set your computer up, this chapter would have got you going. And there's some comments about things that relate to 2019 in here as well. It covers things like setting the computer up, what all the cables do, printers, data set, video display, that type of thing. And what happens today if you just pick up the C128 and you don't have any of these things. Chapter 5 describes 3 operating modes of the Commodore 128. Of course, you have the Commodore 128 mode, you have the C64 mode, and you have the CPM mode. It goes into great detail about what all these different modes are and what you can do with them, and how you access them. And if you're like me, and the last time you used CPM was 35 or so years ago, there's actually a lot of good information in this book on getting started with the CPM operating system. So I found that kind of interesting because I forgot everything I ever knew about CPM. Chapter 6 is another kind of throwback chapter from the original manuscript that deals with software from back in the day, as far as productivity, as far as word processing, database management, spreadsheets and graph making, educational software, even online opportunities from back in that time period. And of course, entertainment, games and everything, everybody's favorite part. Chapter 7 is about telecommunications on the 128, which was what we had back in 1985 because there was no internet. This chapter does a really good job at contrasting what was available in 1985, starting with modems on the telephone line, the different modems that Commodore had available at that time, and even logging onto a BBS today using a modem. Goes through some of the software used, how to use BBSs today using the various Ethernet and Wi-Fi adapters that are available. It's kind of interesting seeing the contrast between how you would have gotten, online in 1985 and how we do that today. Chapter 8 is a chapter for programmers, and it's not a how to program chapter, but it's about all the programming resources and languages and things that are available for the Commodore 128. It covers Basic 7, which was a very enhanced basic for the Commodore 128 that is just leaps and bounds above what was available in the Commodore 64. It included built-in commands for graphics and sprites, disk access, different program aids, had a machine language monitor built in, and it even had commands for talking to the RAM expansion module. Oh, and a lot better built-in commands for talking to the SID. Chapter 9 is about software, disk images, and things like that. Now this is mostly written from a 2019 perspective with some contrasting in with 1985, how things would have been done then. There's a lot of resources giving in here, different websites, BBSs, and what disk images are and how you use them. Chapter 10 is mostly a view of what you would have done for service for your Commodore 128 back in the day, from the things the average user might have wanted to do themselves to what if you need to get your computer or monitor worked on, where you would take it, things like that. So it's kind of interesting to see what the recommendations were back then and what we can do today as far as availability of parts and things like that. And in the very back of the book, there's an appendix. And this has a lot of different things in it, from a glossary of terms which would have been important to, the neophyte computer user in 1985. And there's a list of tables and control codes, screen codes, and things like that that the average user would probably need. All in all, I found this a very interesting book. I really liked the contrasting of the 1985 vintage information and the new information. For somebody that is just starting out in the retro computer hobby and you're interested in getting a Commodore 128, this book has a lot of information in it. If you're somebody that already knows a lot about the Commodore 128, you might still appreciate the book and enjoy it because of that contrasting from the vintage and new that I was talking about. It wasn't very expensive. I enjoyed reading it, and I'm glad to have this on my bookshelf. If you want to pick up a copy of this book, I put the link down below in the description. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this quick look at the Vintage Commodore 128 Personal Computer Handbook by Margaret Morabito. Again, the link to this on Amazon is in the description down below. It's nice that even in 2019, you can still go and buy interesting new books about computers from the 1980s. It's nice when we're able to support people that put the work into doing things like this, that it encourages more development. And it's the same way with new software being written for our old computers. If we support the people doing that, then it encourages them to keep working hard at it. If you're a subscriber, thank you. I really appreciate it. It helps out a lot. If you're not a subscriber, look for the rectangular subscribe button down below and poke on that guy, and it'll subscribe you to the channel. When you do that, you'll notice that there's a bell-shaped icon, and if you click on that, it'll tell you just as soon as I post a new video. While you're down there clicking on stuff, go ahead and click on that thumbs up icon if you've enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or comments, please let me know down below. I always like hearing from folks. Until next time, bye.